Morparia, thank you very much for being with us here on our special series, India's Independence, 65 years. We have so much to cherish, but when one looks a little forward, the next 5 seem like a mountain to climb. Why?
I don't really agree that it's a mountain to climb. I mean, the worst that we are talking about India just now is a growth between 6 and 6.5%. In a scenario where people are struggling to just stay stable or maybe grow at 1 or 2%, it's not a bad place to be in.
No, but I know it's not a bad place to be, but India has been in a better position for a very long time and someone hung on to it, whether it's global investors looking at India, a domestic growth story that sort of kicked in. Do you think that somehow there's been a cloud of negativity that has enveloped India and we're finding it hard to unshackle?
So I think there is a cloud of negativity. Certainly there is a lot of international media attention on the negatives coming out of India. There's a lot of domestic media attention on the negative sentiment in India. But if you look at the fundamental India story, which makes it so unique in terms of one of the few economies in the world which has a very well-balanced growth capabilities for both investment and consumption. That fundamental story still remains there. We are just now focusing on all the negatives to say we are not growing at 8%, we are growing instead at 6 or maybe 6.5%. But the underlying fundamentals of India, I don't think have undergone a change.
So, I mean, when one looks at the fundamentals, you've got, demand at one level, consumer demand mostly, the manufacturing, we've got investment. Now, many of these fundamentals of the last few years, through whatever represents their data, is suggesting that IIP is down sharply. Private investment is now down nearly 35% according to our latest report. Do you think these are sort of overreactions to an India story?
So there is an investment slowdown, but when we are looking at a 5-year horizon, I was talking about the potential, and certainly, that kind of exists, so I'm not as negative about it. There is an investment slowdown, undoubtedly it's so. And it is partly on account of some of what we call policy issues around land, environment, partly on account of the relatively high interest rates in India. Yeah. But I see that the underlying momentum is there. So, and it's not as though that the land issue is the same throughout the country. You see pockets of within our country where land is getting aggregated, industries are coming up. I know environment currently has been an issue. Yeah. And we certainly hope that we can solve some of the policy issues around that. But land reform will certainly help, but there are pockets still in India which demonstrate that despite the current law, we are still able to aggregate land and industries manage to come up.
Right. So I guess it's more at this moment projected than it actually may be on the ground. But let's talk about the fact that as we celebrate 65 years of independence, clearly we have proven to ourselves that the Hindu growth rate was a story of the past. But now that we are once again feeling, for various reasons, global factors and so on, a slowdown, what would Kalpana Morparia attribute them to? Where are the problems?
So the problem is what we discussed earlier, is the investment, because consumption is holding on very well. Okay. Given Narega, given the overall MSP prices, given the relative balance of outside agriculture within rural India, I think the consumption story is really holding on very well. All of the newer services sector industry that India has unleashed over the last 2 decades are once again playing on to the consumption side, as indeed is the demographic dividend. So it's really the investment story. And that is where I think Indian entrepreneurs have always had great animal spirits. I mean, we have to remind ourselves that 65 years ago, we were under foreign occupation, and we still had animal spirits of the Indian entrepreneurs, even under foreign occupation, building industries.
So you're saying that now the next few decades will be really about building new industry, newer entrepreneurs will come onto the fore, which means that will drive that whole investment cycle and keep the financial veins going.
Absolutely. Whether it's infrastructure, whether it's manufacturing capacity. I mean, would you believe a story that E.T. carried today? Would you have believed this story 10, 15 years ago to say that the Japanese are making motorcycles in India so that they can export them back to Japan? We think it is some fairy tale that is being told. But today, India has shown its capability in becoming an auto hub. Yeah. In the IT services industries, we've shown, we can build world-class businesses in India. So, pharmaceutical industry. We've built world-class companies in India. And therefore, I think this big investment cycle that in any case, given the vast country that we are and the population that we have and the opportunity we have, both in the resource area as well as the more general infrastructure, will definitely drive growth.
So when you look at the kind of, industries and entrepreneurs who approach you and your bank for advice, what do you think is signaling towards the next wave? Are these going to be social entrepreneurs? Are these going to be people who are into their, new age social media technology side? Where do you see them? Or do you see that India still has its heart in some elements of outsourcing on the IT front and manufacturing as well?
Manufacturing, IT, and a whole lot of service innovation that's taking place. You see a lot of small startup internet companies, across the full spectrum of the internet and data space.
Yeah.
So there will be multiple models, and just given our demographics and just given the relative per capita incomes that we have, India is increasingly focusing on how to build a model that can service literally the people at the bottom of the pyramid.
Right.
So to borrow from C.K. Prahlad's space, we can actually build innovative business models that makes it possible for us to service the relatively lower per capita income people that we are servicing here. And eventually we can export these business models outside, that Indian companies have got a great this thing. So currently some of the policies issues appear to be throwing somewhat of a wet blanket on us.
Yeah.
I think the animal spirits are there, and you will see a lot more. In some ways, Shaili, I'm amazed at the number of first generation entrepreneurs that I meet.
Right.
So I would say
the risk-taking abilities
in
are
a given
intact.
month, I probably meet a third of first generation entrepreneurs. This would not have been true 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah. And it's finally, that fire in the belly is actually chasing finance, finding a way to scale up and so on. Okay, I want to focus on policy and ask you, there has been much said about the equivalent of policy paralysis and cliches such as. But what is it that you feel as a company, a foreign company operating out of India, how much of a constraint is policy? Are we making far too much out of the government's role in India Inc. or India's ability to grow?
So let me first address the financial services issue. I think India is extremely open, with the exception of insurance and pension, where we are limiting foreign ownership to 26%. I would rank India as one of the most open countries on financial services. 100% in investment banking, asset management, non-bank finance companies, completely level playing field there.
Yeah.
A much more openness even on the part of Reserve Bank of India to give more branches to foreign players. I rate all that very well. So I wouldn't say that any policy issue is hampering us other than the insurance and pension segment. On the more general issue about policy impact, so as I said, that impacts land aggregation to some effect. And the entire environment is a big issue. And the other big issue is, since we are such a young country, the government maybe is not playing as great an enabling role in terms of skilling people. So big issue for India is every year 10 to 12 million people come into the job market. Are we skilling them well enough? It is the job of the private sector to create the opportunities for them to get employed.
Yeah.
And today, instead of saying the government's not doing, government's not doing enough, the private sector has actually demonstrated that in the services sector, we can take whatever skill level they've got,
and then
put them through a university of our own making and train them. And we are today building world-class business models.
The next big disaster for us would be a jobless growth story.
Absolutely. Because again, when I meet some of my foreign counterparts, what amazes them is the relative social stability in India.
Yeah.
I think it's got to do a lot with our religion as well. And if we today continue to create jobs, and the private sector, rather than moaning about what it is that the government is not doing and doing in terms of skilling, actually puts a much greater effort in terms of their own initiatives on doing that. The National Skill Development Program that the government, which is really going to be run by the private sector.
That's right.
And this same entrepreneurial spirit that has been driving India for these decades, if we focus much more in on that, I think it will be a very significant improvement.
to you by Hero Maestro, such a boy thing. Cola. JP Group's Yamuna Expressway. Drive smooth, drive safe. The Neo-Fluidic Elantra, your signature of success.
Once upon a time, a thirsty crow decided to quench his thirst. But he just couldn't reach the water. Then he tried something smarter, and the crow reached his goal.
So Daddy, is thinking differently smarter?
Always, son.
Save smarter with recurring savings plan from Birla Sun Life Mutual Fund.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
भाई साहब गोवा के लिए 3 एयर टिकट बुक कर दो। ऑफ कोर्स सर जी, आपको बिल्कुल चीप एंड बेस्ट टिकट देता हूँ जी। डन सर, ओनली 50,000 रुपीज। 50?
अरे डैड, goibibo.com है ना?
Book directly on goibibo.com and save money.
समझे अंकल?
goibibo.com.
The Swatch Group has been recognized worldwide as the crown jewel of the Swiss watch industry. Presenting the Basel World 2012 Swatch Group Special. A special presentation on the various brands that make up the diversified Swatch Group. Only on ET Now.
Let's talk about financial services. Again there, as you said, it's as open as it gets, and there should be no reason to complain on that front. But today, how are we looking? It looks like a space where banks are suddenly no longer the hot favorites, neither of the stock market, nor in terms of an earnings point of view. Do you think there's a little more bleeding left to go on the banking space in India?
So again, I think we are completely overplaying this NPL issue in the Indian banking segment.
Okay.
If you actually look at hard data, the overall resilience of the Indian banking system, I think, should be a cause for envy of the world. The amount of regulation we have, the amount of reserve requirements that we have, and even let's tackle the issue of NPLs. If you look at the trend in NPL growth that we've seen over the last few quarters, it is largely in some of the sectors that are under stress.
Yes.
In infrastructure, aviation. But you're not seeing that same trend in either personal loans or in the agricultural segment. So if you disaggregate that data and look at the trending that has happened, the other thing to note is that overall bank credit has actually slowed down.
Yes.
One would typically see a big NPL problem where you've seen, 30-35% growth. Have you been too aggressive in lending and then a problem? That's not been so. Look at the data in the last 3 years. The average bank credit growth has been around 17% to 19%.
Right.
And we talk a lot about restructured loans as though restructured loan is our way of camouflaging non-performing loans.
Is it though? Because how it is. Right now, anything that's not an NPL is in the equivalent of a CDR, corporate debt restructuring case. So, from an outsider's point of view, investors, shareholders are often confused. What is going on? There's so much provisioning.
It is a one-time restructuring exercise that's done. And if you look at the situation in the mid-90s, where India was probably the most hurt in terms of asset impairment, the experience shows, ever since the CDR mechanism came in the early 2000s, that actually less than 10 to 15% slip into NPL. So to bracket all of that restructured as just another lump of impaired loans, I think is incorrect. One should look at disaggregated data there. And if you factor all of this in, I think the NPL fear is quite a bit overblown.
Would you say that largely in the private sector, or do you think the public sector, piece itself, purely by way of often being under pressure to give loans to certain sectors, could there be a higher impact on, let's say, public sector banks?
So the percentages will show that it's slightly higher for the public sector banks than it is for the private sector banks. But again, I think we need to do a deeper analysis. Are these hard assets on the ground? Where you need to restructure because the fuel linkage has not happened, the PPA has not got tied up, projects gotten delayed? Or is it something that never justified the lending in the first place? And if you does, wherever you have physical assets on the ground, you will end up taking some sacrifice.
Yes.
Because you might need to write down a part of the debt, convert it into equity, or fund a part of the interest during the construction phase. But I would not say that this is a big impaired loan.
And at this moment, you